Jonathan Harris sat in his dimly lit apartment, the familiar sounds of the city muted by the double-pane windows that separated him from the world outside. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound that punctuated the silence, marking the end of another long, uneventful day. He nursed a cup of black coffee, its warmth a small comfort in the solitude he had grown accustomed to over the years. The television murmured in the background, playing some late-night talk show that he wasn't really watching. He was scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone when it buzzed with a new message. Jonathan frowned, the unexpected vibration breaking his monotonous routine. His circle of contacts was small, colleagues from work, a few acquaintances, and the occasional text from his sister checking in on him. Rarely did anyone reach out to him this late, and when they did, it was usually for something trivial. Curiosity piqued, Jonathan opened the message. "Remember the old days, John? I need your help." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The words were simple, but they struck him like a bolt of lightning. He stared at the screen, his eyes glued to the name signed at the bottom. David. For a moment, the world around him seemed to blur, and he was no longer in his small apartment, but back in the halls of his college dorm, where he and David had once been inseparable. They had been the closest of friends, bound by a shared sense of humor and an unspoken understanding that came from being two outcasts in a world that didn't quite know what to do with them. But that was years ago. A lifetime, really. Jonathan hadn't heard from David in over a decade. After graduation, life had pulled them in different directions, and their friendship, once so vital, had withered away under the weight of time and distance. The occasional attempt to reconnect had fizzled out, and eventually they had stopped trying altogether. He read the message again, trying to make sense of it. The words were unmistakably David's, the tone, the familiarity. They were like echoes of a time Jonathan had almost forgotten. But why now? And what could David possibly want after all these years? Jonathan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to let the past stay buried where it belonged. But another part, the part that still remembered those late-night talks and shared secrets, urged him to respond. He finally typed out a reply, his fingers shaking slightly as he pressed each key. "David, is this really you? What's going on?" He hit send and waited. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Jonathan's eyes were fixed on the screen, waiting for the familiar 3 dots that would signal David was typing back. But nothing happened. Instead, a small red exclamation point appeared next to his message. Message not delivered. Jonathan's frown deepened. He checked the number again, but it wasn't one he recognized. He tried calling, but the line was dead. A knot of unease began to form in his stomach. Who could have sent the message? And why use David's name? He put the phone down, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. It was probably a prank, he told himself. Or maybe a wrong number. Someone out there was messing with him, that's all. But as he tried to convince himself, a memory flickered at the edge of his mind. David's voice, serious and insistent, warning him about something he couldn't quite remember. Something they had both promised never to speak of again. Jonathan shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts that were beginning to crowd his mind. It was late, and he was tired. His imagination was running wild, filling in blanks that didn't need to be filled. He decided to let it go, tossing the phone onto the couch and heading to bed. But even as he turned out the lights and lay down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw David's name on the screen. The words, "I need your help," echoing in his mind. He tossed and turned, the message replaying over and over until it was etched into his thoughts. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with fragmented memories of the past, images of David, their college days, and something dark lurking just out of sight. When Jonathan woke the next morning, the unease from the night before still clung to him like a shadow. He reached for his phone, half expecting to find another message, but the screen was blank. He checked the number again, tried calling once more, but it was as dead as before. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the message was more than just a coincidence. As he got ready for work, the words lingered in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. He knew he should probably forget about it, chalk it up to some strange prank or a glitch in the system. But he couldn't. Something about it felt too real, too personal. The message was a thread leading back into the past, one he wasn't sure he wanted to follow. Yet as the day wore on, Jonathan found himself thinking more and more about David, about the friendship they'd once had, and about the secrets they had buried along with it. And as much as he wanted to forget, he knew he wouldn't be able to until he found out what had really happened to David and why his old friend had reached out after all these years. The week following that first message was a blur of tension and unease for Jonathan. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, expecting another cryptic message from David. And they came, each one more perplexing than the last, dripping with an urgency that made Jonathan's skin crawl. "You need to remember, John. It's not safe here anymore. I made a mistake." The messages gnawed at him, their meaning just out of reach, like fragments of a nightmare that faded upon waking. Jonathan knew something was terribly wrong. David wasn't just reaching out to reminisce. He was pleading for help, and it was clear that he was running out of time. Jonathan tried to respond to the messages, but each attempt was met with the same frustrating failure. The phone number was still untraceable, and every call he made was met with dead silence. It was as if David was speaking to him from a place beyond reach, a place where he was slipping further and further away. Desperation began to claw at Jonathan. He couldn't just ignore the messages. David had been his best friend, closer than a brother, and even after all these years, Jonathan felt a sense of responsibility, a need to find out what had happened and to help if he could. His first step was to dig through the past. Jonathan spent hours rifling through old boxes in his apartment, pulling out photo albums, letters, and keepsakes from their college days. Each photo brought back memories. Nights spent drinking cheap beer in their dorm room, road trips to nowhere in particular, late-night conversations about life, dreams, and the future. But the more Jonathan searched, the more something felt off. It wasn't just the passage of time that had faded these memories. It was as if parts of them had been erased altogether. He pulled out an old yearbook from their college days, flipping through the pages until he found the section with their graduating class. Jonathan ran his finger down the list of names, searching for David's photo. But when he found the spot where it should have been, his heart sank. The space was blank. No photo, no name, just an empty void where David's picture should have been. Confused and increasingly alarmed, Jonathan tried to rationalize it. Maybe there had been a printing error, or perhaps David had simply missed the photo session. But deep down, Jonathan knew it was something more, something much worse. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Jonathan decided to visit David's last known address. It was the only tangible lead he had, the only place that might hold some answers. He remembered the house well. David had moved there shortly after college, a modest place in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. When Jonathan arrived, he was struck by how little the neighborhood had changed. The trees were taller, the paint on some of the houses had faded, but it was still the same sleepy street he remembered. He parked his car at the curb and walked up to the house, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and trepidation. The house looked exactly as it had the last time Jonathan had visited all those years ago. A single-story home with a neatly kept lawn and a small garden out front. But as he approached the front door, something felt wrong. The house seemed empty, like it had been hollowed out and left as a shell. Jonathan knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected. To see David standing there, maybe, with that same easy smile he remembered. But when the door opened, it was a stranger who greeted him, a woman in her 70s, her face lined with age and confusion as she looked at Jonathan. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but guarded. Jonathan cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm looking for someone who used to live here," he said. David Carter. He's an old friend of mine." The woman's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name," she said. "I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've never heard of a David Carter." Jonathan's stomach dropped. He stared at the woman, trying to process what she was saying. "But that can't be right," he insisted. "David lived here. I've been to this house before. I know he lived here." The woman shook her head, looking at Jonathan with a mix of pity and concern. "I'm sorry," she repeated, "but I've never known anyone by that name. Maybe you have the wrong address." Jonathan's mind raced. How could this be happening? He knew this was the right house. He had been here before, he was sure of it. But the woman's insistence, her genuine confusion, made him doubt himself. He apologized quickly and left, his thoughts a chaotic mess as he walked back to his car. Jonathan spent the next few hours knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they remembered David. But the answers were all the same. No one knew a David Carter. No one had ever seen him. And as far as they were concerned, the house had always belonged to the elderly woman living there now. By the time Jonathan returned to his car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He sat behind the wheel, staring blankly at the dashboard, his mind reeling. How could David simply not exist? How could an entire neighborhood forget someone who had lived among them? He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages again, trying to find some clue, some hint that could explain what was happening. But the messages offered no answers, only more questions, more confusion. "Remember the deal." The words jumped out at him, sending a shiver down his spine. What deal? Jonathan racked his brain, trying to recall any mention of a deal, any memory of David talking about something like that. But there was nothing, only a vague sense of unease, like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into something dark and unknown. As he drove home, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just that David had disappeared. It was as if he had been erased from existence altogether, like a character in a story who had been written out without a trace. That night, Jonathan sat in his apartment, surrounded by the remnants of his past, photos, letters, mementos, all proof of a life he had lived, a friendship he had cherished. But the more he searched, the more he realized that the evidence was incomplete. There were gaps, missing pieces that he couldn't explain. And in those gaps, Jonathan began to see the outlines of a truth too terrifying to comprehend. David hadn't just disappeared, he had been erased. And if the messages were to be believed, Jonathan might be next. Jonathan awoke the next morning with a heavy sense of dread, as though the weight of the previous days had finally settled onto his chest. The questions about David, his disappearance, the strange messages, the unsettling encounters with people who had no memory of his friend, swirled in his mind, a storm of confusion and fear that he couldn't seem to escape. He sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His apartment, usually a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a stranger's home. The walls seemed closer, the light dimmer, as if the very fabric of his world was slowly unraveling. Jonathan knew he couldn't continue like this. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening, not just to David, but to himself as well. The gnawing sense that his own reality was slipping through his fingers was too powerful to ignore. He decided to visit the one place where he thought he might find some trace of David's existence, their old college. It was a long shot, but Jonathan was desperate. If he could just find some record, some proof that David had been real, maybe he could start to piece together the mystery that was threatening to consume him. The drive to the college was surreal. The familiar landmarks of the city passed by in a blur, but they seemed different somehow, as if viewed through a distorted lens. Colors were muted, edges softer, and for a fleeting moment, Jonathan wondered if he was dreaming. But the tight knot in his stomach and the pounding of his heart assured him that this was no dream. This was real, terrifyingly, inescapably real. When he arrived at the college, the campus was quiet, the summer break leaving it nearly deserted. Jonathan walked through the empty corridors, memories of his student days rushing back. But even these memories felt distant, like echoes from another lifetime. He made his way to the administration building, hoping to find the records office still open. The clerk at the desk, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, greeted him with a polite smile. Jonathan explained that he was looking for information on a former student, an old friend named David Carter. The woman nodded and began typing into her computer, the soft clicking of the keyboard the only sound in the otherwise silent room. After a few moments, the woman's brow furrowed in confusion. She typed a few more commands, then shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing up at Jonathan with a puzzled expression. "But there's no record of a David Carter ever attending this school. Are you sure about the name and the dates?" Jonathan felt his heart sink. "Yes, I'm sure," he insisted, his voice strained. "We graduated together. I know he was here." The woman frowned, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I've checked the database and the archived records, but there's nothing. It's like he was never here at all." Jonathan's mind raced. How could this be possible? He had shared classes with David, spent countless hours studying together, even walked across the stage at graduation side by side. But now, it was as if none of it had ever happened. The walls of reality were closing in, and Jonathan felt like he was suffocating. Desperation clawed at him as he asked the clerk to check again, to search through old yearbooks or class lists, anything that might show David's name. But each search yielded the same result. David Carter didn't exist. Not in the records, not in the yearbooks, not in the collective memory of the college. Jonathan's hands trembled as he left the office, the the woman's concerned gaze following him as he stumbled out into the hallway. As Jonathan wandered the campus, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. It wasn't just that David had disappeared. It was as if the entire world had conspired to erase him, to scrub him from existence as though he had never been there. And the more Jonathan searched for answers, the more elusive they became. He found himself at the campus library, drawn there by some subconscious need to find a tangible connection to his past. The library had always been a sanctuary for Jonathan during his college years, a place where he could lose himself in books and temporarily forget the outside world. But as he walked through the rows of shelves, the familiar scent of old paper and ink did little to comfort him. Instead, it only deepened his sense of unease. Jonathan pulled down a yearbook from his graduation year, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. He skimmed over the photos of classmates and faculty, looking for David's face, his name, anything. But just like the records in the administration office, the yearbook offered no proof of David's existence. The spot where David's photo should have been was empty, a blank space that seemed to mock Jonathan's growing desperation. Frustration bubbled up inside him, and he slammed the book shut, the sound echoing through the silent library. He was losing his grip on reality, the lines between memory and madness blurring with each passing moment. He couldn't trust his own mind anymore, not when it was telling him that someone who had been so important to him had simply vanished without a trace. Jonathan left the library, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. He couldn't go back to his apartment, not now, not when it felt like the walls were closing in on him. Instead, he found himself wandering the streets of the city, hoping that movement might somehow clear his head, might help him make sense of the impossible situation he was trapped in. As night fell, the city around him took on an otherworldly quality. The familiar streets and buildings seemed to shimmer at the edges, as if they were not quite solid, not quite real. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something unseen was lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. And then, in the midst of his aimless wandering, his phone buzzed again. Jonathan fumbled for it, his heart pounding in his chest. Another message from the unknown number. "They're coming for you, John. Don't let them take you." His breath caught in his throat as he read the words. Who was coming for him? What did it mean? The message filled him with a primal terror, the kind that gripped him deep in his bones. He wanted to dismiss it as some sick joke, but the reality of his situation made that impossible. David's warnings, the inexplicable gaps in his memory, the way the world around him seemed to be unraveling, it all pointed to something far beyond his understanding, something terrifying and inexorable. Jonathan knew he had to keep moving. He couldn't go back to his apartment, couldn't risk being alone. But where could he go? Who could he turn to when the world itself seemed to be conspiring against him? As he walked, his mind raced through the possibilities, trying to find some solution, some way out of this nightmare. But deep down, Jonathan knew the truth. There was no escape. Whatever was happening to David, whatever deal he had made, it was coming for Jonathan now. And no matter how hard he fought it, no matter how desperately he tried to cling to the reality he knew, it was slipping away from him, piece by piece. His phone buzzed again, and Jonathan almost didn't want to look. But he had to. He needed to know, even if the knowledge was the thing that would destroy him. The message was simple, but it chilled him to the core. Remember the deal. Jonathan's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He racked his brain, trying to remember, trying to piece together the fragments of his past that were now so elusive. But there was nothing, just a void where the memory should have been. What deal? What had David done? And more importantly, what had Jonathan forgotten? As he stumbled through the darkened streets, Jonathan's reality continued to crumble around him. The world he had once known was gone, replaced by a terrifying, incomprehensible nightmare. And as he realized the full extent of what was happening, Jonathan knew there was no turning back. Whatever was coming for him, whatever had taken David, it was closing in. And soon, very soon, it would find him. The address from the latest message led Jonathan to the fringes of the city, to a place where even the streetlights seemed to have given up the fight against the darkness. The warehouse loomed ahead of him, its silhouette stark against the night sky. It was an old, decaying structure, forgotten by time and left to rot in the shadows. The air around it was thick with a silence that felt almost suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jonathan hesitated at the entrance, a cold wind biting at his skin. But the pull of the mystery, of the truth, was too strong to resist. He pushed open the heavy metal door, the screech of rusted hinges echoing through the empty corridors. The darkness inside was oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides as he made his way deeper into the bowels of the building. His footsteps were the only sound, each one reverberating in the cavernous space, amplifying the sense of isolation that had taken hold of him. The messages from David had stopped, leaving Jonathan alone in the void, with only his fear and the oppressive silence for company. As he walked, the walls around him seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows twisting and shifting in the periphery of his vision. Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart racing in his chest. The oppressive weight of impending doom hung over him, growing heavier with each step he took. At the end of a long, narrow hallway, he found it, a small room, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling out into the darkness. Jonathan hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open, revealing the room's sparse contents. It was empty, save for a single battered desk in the center. On the desk, illuminated by the weak light of a flickering bulb, was a piece of paper. Jonathan's hands trembled as he approached, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The air in the room felt colder, denser, as if something unseen was watching him, waiting for him to make his move. He picked up the paper, recognizing David's handwriting immediately. The note was short, but its words carried the weight of finality. I made a deal to erase my past, to start anew, but the cost was my existence. Now they're coming for you too. I'm sorry, John. I never meant for this to happen. Jonathan's breath hitched in his throat as he read the words over and over, his mind struggling to comprehend their meaning. A deal. David had made a deal, a choice to erase his past, to wipe the slate clean. But the price he had paid was unimaginable, his entire existence erased as if it had never been. And now the same fate awaited Jonathan. The truth hit him like a sledgehammer, the realization sinking deep into his bones. David hadn't just disappeared. He had been consumed, devoured by whatever dark force he had bargained with. And now that force had turned its gaze on Jonathan, pulling him inexorably toward the same fate. He felt a sudden chill sweep through the room, the shadows around him deepening, pressing in closer. The light from the bulb flickered, casting the room in a strobe of dim, erratic flashes. Jonathan's hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, desperation clawing at him. He had to warn someone, had to leave some trace of himself before it was too late. But as he unlocked the screen, he saw that his phone was already open to a new message. The words were typed out, ready to be sent. "I understand now. Goodbye." A sob caught in Jonathan's throat as he realized that he didn't remember typing the message. It was as if someone, or something, had guided his hand, had compelled him to write his own farewell. The last act of a man who was already fading from the world. Jonathan's vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. He was losing himself, slipping away piece by piece, just as David had. The memories he had fought so hard to hold on to were unraveling, dissolving into nothingness. He could feel it, the slow erasure of his existence, the gradual fading of his very being from the fabric of reality. His hands trembled violently as he pressed send, the message vanishing into the void. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the small room. Jonathan collapsed into the chair by the desk, his head in his hands as the last vestiges of his strength drained away. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, until there was nothing left but the faintest flicker of light from the dying bulb. Jonathan felt himself fading, his body growing lighter, less substantial, as if he were turning to smoke, to mist, to nothing. He tried to hold on, tried to remember who he was, what he had been. But the memories slipped through his fingers like sand, the details of his life, his childhood, his friendships, his very name, drifting away into the darkness. As the final moment approached, Jonathan looked up, his eyes glazed with tears. The world around him was a blur, fading into a void of darkness and silence. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, and soon even that would be taken from him. With a final shuddering breath, Jonathan felt the last of his consciousness slip away. There was no pain, no fear, just an overwhelming emptiness, an absence that swallowed him whole. And then there was nothing. The warehouse stood silent, the faint light from the bulb flickering one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. The note on the desk, once held by hands that no longer existed, lay undisturbed, the final testament to a man who had been erased from the world. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the loss, to the lives that had been consumed and forgotten. There was no trace of Jonathan, no sign that he had ever been there. Just an empty warehouse, a cold wind blowing through the cracks in the walls, and a silence that echoed with the finality of a life that had ceased to exist. And somewhere, in the vast emptiness that remained, a whisper, faint, barely audible, like the last breath of a dying man, was carried away on the wind. Goodbye.